Hello class. I hope you all enjoyed the previous lesson on the Varangur, a harsh and brutal people whose vengeful god may one day push them to make war across all of Panathor. For today's lesson, we will speak of a people who are in all ways possible quite their opposite. Today, we will speak of the Halflings. Shorter than a dwarf but similar in shape to a human, although with heads, hands, and feet a bit larger in proportion, the Halflings are a race known for their rather laid-back attitude towards life, an attitude that seems rather strange considering their short lifespans, at least compared to other races, with most Halflings not living long past their 50s. Unlike humans, however, who despair at their short time on this world, and are envious of longer-lived races, Halflings seem to simply accept what others would view as a limitation. This acceptance of not only their lifespans but whatever else others would consider a detriment tends to make them unenvious of whatever so-called advantages other races may have. For example, although Halflings are far shorter than other races, they consider themselves a perfect size, seeing all others as simply abnormally tall. That reminds me, I should know that Halfling is a name given to the race by others, obviously in reference to their short stature. Halflings tend to refer to themselves either as the people when discussing their race as a whole, or a name derived from their place of origin, with those living in the Shires calling themselves Shire folk, and those residing in the city of Edge calling themselves the people of Edge. Something to keep in mind if you ever meet a Halfling and wish to be polite. The origins of such a laid-back and content people are unknown. The earliest written records are millennia old, and as a result are sparse and incomplete. Furthermore, these records were all written by other races, as at the time the Halflings did not have a written language, relying instead on oral history, which of course changed quite a bit over generations of retelling. What is believed by most scholars is that the Halflings were created by a god sometime after the elves, humans, and dwarves, a god that they apparently worshipped, although who that god might have been has long ago been lost to time. As for that god's possible fate, it is assumed they were either removed by the Celestians or killed during the God War, an assumption believed by all except for the Halflings. For whatever reason, it seems impossible for Halflings to even consider that their god might be dead, firmly believing that this being either abandoned them or can no longer interact with the mortal races, a belief that is so ingrained within the Halfling mind that a common curse among them is missing gods, the curse expressing a general frustration with whatever they are dealing with. The early Halflings were a wary people who tended to keep to themselves, living as nomadic clans who herded animals, lived in tents, and tried to avoid anything bigger than they were, a time referred to by the Halflings as the Wandering Times. These clans were composed of family groups which were led by the eldest family member, the elder establishing the rules and making any important decisions. If a clan ever became too large, members would split off and form new ones, but family ties would be remembered. The Halflings only interact with other races to trade, offering them meat, hides, and milk of their herds as well as interesting devices for iron tools and steel blades. From the records, one of their more sought-after items in those times was a foldable tent, an ingenious device that showcased the Halfling's gift in the creation of devices that made their lives easier. This was the Halfling way of life until around the second millennium after the God War. Before then, despite their inventive nature, Halfling society was rather static, focused as they were more in survival than innovation. But for reasons unknown, they began finally introducing the common technology of the other races into their own. They soon began writing, although this writing was almost always in the common tongue. Their own language, known as Tinker Tongue, remained mostly spoken. They also, and this may sound a bit strange, finally began making use of the wheel. I can only assume they previously considered the wheel unnecessary, as they viewed roads as far too open to attack, preferring to travel on foot through territory with plenty of places to hide. With the introduction of the wheel came wagons, pulled by cattle, oxen, and ponies. They not only allowed for the transport of a larger number of goods, but were also much sturdier homes than the tents they previously used. Additionally, these wagons could be circled and become ready-made fortified defenses in case of attack. The clans also started to become larger, And on occasion, several would come together and establish camps which remained in one spot for weeks or even months at a time, not only becoming a perfect place to trade and socialize, but also allow some forms of limited farming. This slow push towards stability soon reached its inevitable conclusion in 2180, when a large number of halflings gathered together to hear the words of Bron Abbott, the leader of one of the larger clans. It was there on the Arvandus plains that Bron declared that he and his family were tired of their endless wandering. The plains they stood on were rich, fertile, and nearly unoccupied. He intended to found a permanent settlement and invited others to join him. A radical idea for a people who had lived for millennia as nomads, but so convincing was Bron that a majority of the families gathered there agreed, and a region of the plains known as Abbott Shire was staked out, with their first settlement known as Yangmere founded near a large lake. The homes within Yangmere and all other towns within Abbott Shire were made to mimic the shape of the dome tents that the halflings had previously lived in during their wandering times, usually large 8 or 12-sided structures, with a smaller second floor to allow the home to have a dome or beehive shape. Dirt was placed upon the walls and roofs to allow grass to grow and form what many have called a picturesque view. Although the halflings did have an eye for beauty in the town's construction, the layout of their towns also had defense in mind. Like the circled wagons of times past, the homes of the halflings were placed in ever-expanding circles, with the windows and doors facing inwards towards the town's center, and in between each circle of homes were spaces that the halflings could quickly fill with rocks to form barriers in case of enemy attack. And over time, when no major disasters had fallen upon Abbottshire, many more halflings gravitated towards the territory, and with the expanding population, 4 more shires were founded: Tanshire, Daleshire, Southshire, and Hoddenshire. Now recall how I stated previously that the Arvandus plains were only nearly unoccupied. There were non-halflings who considered that section of the plains home, perhaps lone hunters or small families who made a living there. Sadly, their occupation of such lands changed quickly, as the halflings fully took what they considered theirs. You see, class, there is a second nature to halflings that is not commonly known. Although halflings during their wandering times were a wary people who tended to run away from large threats, when backed into a corner, they could fight like wolverines, fighting with a ferocity that could surprise an unsuspecting foe. And that ferocity now extended to protecting what they considered their territory. I find it easy to believe that any other race living in those lands now found themselves forcibly evicted rather quickly. The only exception being the creatures that reside in the Target Deeps, the forests of Karnem, and the swamps east of Yangmere, the creatures known as forest trolls. Although not as ferocious as the trolls that follow the Orcs, or as intelligent as the snow trolls of the Northern Alliance, they were still formidable creatures, and removing them from the Shires would be quite a challenge. However, the halflings had a better idea. Through negotiation and trade, the halflings formed an alliance with the forest trolls, gaining a labor force to help them on their farms, and a fighting arm to help in any battles protect their territory. With a permanent home established, the social structure and governance of halfling society also changed. Initially, Bron was the de facto leader of Abbottshire and the surrounding shires. Beneath him were each shire's mayors and town councilmen that were voted in by each shire's local families, individuals Bron wisely consulted with before making any important decisions. And after Bron's death, a council called the Assembly was established, with a representative from each village and town that met in Yangmere to discuss issues and vote on them. As time passed and more communities were founded, their previous arrangement became impractical. Soon, each of the 5 shires created their own shire council to deal with local affairs, and each sent 3 representatives to the assembly which handled issues that dealt with the halflings as a whole. And from within this assembly, a head councillor was elected from amongst them to serve a 3-year term, and be the deciding vote in particularly contentious decisions. The role of men and women in government also changed. Although there were no restrictions when it came to leadership, most women focused on running households as the halfling population increased substantially, with each family usually supporting a large number of children. Although I will say, even though there tended to be far more men than women in positions of leadership, it did not mean men had any real power in halfling society. It was often said that while the men bickered in their councils over unimportant minutiae, it was usually the matriarchal heads of the households who made any important decisions concerning the shires. Each of the shires focused primarily on agriculture, the land seemingly blessed with perfect growing conditions, stable climate, and mild seasons. So much so that many scholars and academics have begun to wonder if something magical is occurring to cause it, especially considering that lands outside of the Shires are nowhere near as blessed. Along with these fertile lands were their innovations in agriculture. The Halflings are natural tinkerers, and seem especially adept at creating tools to aid them in whatever task they put their minds to, especially in farming, such as the harvester, which uses troll might and mechanical ingenuity to harvest crops rather quickly. With blessed lands and clever tools, the Halflings began to grow a large variety of crops such as wheat, rye, oats, hops, as well as all manner of vegetables, and their vineyards practically burst with fruit, producing some of the finest wines on the continent. And like the dwarves, the Halflings have quite the taste for tobacco, and make a significant crop of it, said to be of such high quality that even the usually picky dwarves praise it. So massive were their crop yields that the Halflings usually had a large surplus of food, even accounting for the fact that the Halflings eat far more than their small size would indicate. Food soon became a major export, especially to the nearby nation known as the League of Rhodia. So much so that the Halflings' main capital was eventually moved to the town closest to the League, known as Huttenberg. And from the League they imported various metals unavailable on their own lands, metals they used for their own manufacturing, which tended to occur in small workshops in each village, creating devices for local needs, with only a few places producing things on a larger scale. With such a prosperous and bountiful society, it is sadly necessary to protect it, especially considering that the Halflings now had a permanent home, and could no longer simply flee from danger. Thus, a standing army needed to be formed. Now it is probably no surprise that Halflings are not natural soldiers, more interested as they are in tinkering in their workshops, reaping bountiful harvests, and of course, having a good meal. But don't think that makes them weak. As I had said before, anyone who dares disturb their peaceful way of life will face a savage and vicious foe. With friends, the Halflings can be kind, gentle, and quite generous. But to their enemies, they can equally be cold, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless. As strategic points across their territory were fortified strongholds called guardburgs, varying in size from a walled farmhouse with just a few dozen people to a large outpost with facilities for several hundred and more dangerous areas. They regularly sent out patrols and were always on guard for approaching threats. These patrols, and if necessary the army, were composed of what were called trained bands, volunteers from nearby communities who spent their time drilling, manning the guardburgs, and patrolling the borders. The most common fighting unit in a trained band are the Braves, typically equipped with padded leather armor, wooden shields, and a variety of weapons. They were usually the first tour of duty for any new Halfling recruit. Many of them are also drilled in the use of the spear, known as spear spikes. They bravely hold the line no matter the size of the approaching cavalry. Some Halflings are born unusually large, with some even reaching 4.5 feet tall, and are encouraged to make soldiering a full-time profession. With their leather and plate armor, thick shields, and hand weapons, these stalwarts charge into battle with an eagerness that surprises many. Although famous for their agriculture, the Halflings are also known for their skills in animal husbandry, their centuries of breeding programs producing herds of cattle, sheep, and goats that produce milk, cheeses, and meat of the highest quality. It is with these skills that they have bred the miniature Arvandus. Although not as powerful with restorative magic as their larger ancestors, enough of this magic remains to give their Halfling riders far more endurance than they would have otherwise. Most are ridden in troops known as Wild Runners, named for the long races across the plains their riders partake in. They are ideal for harassing the enemy with ranged weapons and, if necessary, they can be equipped with lances to charge into an exposed flank. Some of the more thickly built mounts are encased in armor, and are ridden by similarly armored Halfling stalwarts, known as Juggers. These lance-bearing Halflings are seen to many as the Knights of the Shires, although the Halflings themselves scoff at the idea. And at the vanguard of these armies, you will find swarms of unarmored and light infantry brandishing bows, slings, and hand weapons. Known as poachers and led by a feastmaster, they can be used to scout out or harass an enemy, but their main purpose is to not only forage, but to hunt for any game animals or enemy livestock ahead of the main army, and bring the food back to the Halfling camps, because the idea of an empty stomach is utterly anathema to a Halfling. I should note, it is said that poachers always find some sort of meat to bring back to their camps, even if they find no animals in the area. What do I mean? Let's just say that halfling soldiers have long ago learned to never ask what sort of meat they are consuming in their stew, especially if they start noticing the strange disappearance of enemy bodies. Wherever their meat came from, it's brought back to the halfling chefs to make a proper meal. Although halfling cuisine can seem like magic to those who partake in it, it is usually just the skills of the chef minding the pot. But on occasion, it will not be a simple cook creating the meal, but a figure known as a sorcerer. Now, magic users amongst halflings are rare, with even those who have this spark usually limited in ability compared to other races. Despite this, halflings have always been good at using their inventive minds to overcome what others would consider a disadvantage, and with those minds, they created the magic known as gastromancy. The practitioners of this magic, known as sorcerers, can imbue the food they cook with magic that can enhance endurance, increase strength, and bolster courage. And even better, it can be served to hundreds or even thousands of halflings at one time. A wizard with a fireball can be quite deadly, but a pie that can give an entire army the endurance of a dwarf could change a battle. Like all magic, gastromancy has its dangers. A very small number of halflings become addicted to this magic-infused food, consuming it to such an extent that even other halflings would find the amount consumed gluttonous. If this addiction is not caught quickly enough, the unfortunate halflings may find themselves transformed into a greedy guts, a deformed and hideous creature who will eat any living thing that crosses its path. Loath to kill their own, the halflings usually restrain these poor creatures for their own good, but will occasionally unleash them on an enemy so that the greedy guts can alleviate some of its unending hunger. And leading any particular army is a muster captain and by extension their sergeants, taking their orders from the muster master, who has overall command of all halfling armies of the Shire. They lead their people on whatever mission is necessary to protect their idyllic homes. All of these halfling soldiers were put to the test during the war with Winter, when they had to face roving bands of monsters, bandits, and starving refugees who wished to take what the halflings had so carefully built. Even the halflings suffered during those horrible times. Despite their skill at the production of food, they still suffered from disease and famine that killed more than half their population, as winter's cold grasp froze the land beneath them. While the halflings of the Shires fought both armies and deprivation, those halfling clans who had chosen to continue their nomadic lifestyles had their own issues. They also greatly suffered during the war, but with no land of their own to protect, they were able to travel hundreds of miles south in search of safety, eventually arriving near the forest of Veshlar within the territory of the elves. And there they were, to the surprise of many, given aid by the usually aloof race. The elves helping them establish a permanent settlement, known as the City of Edge, and placing it under their protection. With lands not fully in the grip of winter's chill, and without the need of a major army, the halflings of Edge were able to live in relative peace. Unlike the Shires, they focused on herding instead of farming, shepherding massive herds of differing animals across the territory, and as halflings are wont to do, thinking of inventive ways to make their shepherding lifestyle a bit easier, inventing such wonders as flying machines to overlook their herds, and one half-winged air vehicles for mountain rescue, devices which would later be adapted for military use to rain destruction from above with bombs and shot. Now the halflings of Edge weren't the only ones to adapt their tools for war. After the war with Winter, the halflings of the Shire knew they had to change to survive, and eventually formed an alliance with the League of Rodea for mutual defense. The League, at the time, had become a center of learning with an emphasis on science, engineering, and to a lesser extent, the magic arts, with the most famous of these institutions, the College of Warcraft, being established in their capital of Aelwulf. Many halfling tinkerers traveled to this college, and quite quickly became engineers, their natural talents making them able to quickly grasp mechanical concepts. With their newfound knowledge, the engineers crafted even more efficient farm implements and constructed windmills and other farm aids across their territory, as well as constructing a canal to better facilitate the movement of freight across their territory and into the League. But more notable, at least for our lesson, was the introduction of firearms into halfling armies. Although many still had a preference for crossbows, guns soon made an appearance in various troops such as Windrunners and Braves. Not to mention the use of artillery, such as volley guns to deliver multi-barreled close-range firepower, and howitzers to fire high-explosive projectiles at a long range. But perhaps their most ingenious creation, although it would come at a much later date, is the Iron Beast, inspired by the steel behemoth of the dwarves. But don't let its smaller size fool you, it can be just as devastating as its inspiration. And as the Shire and the League of Rodea grew closer, trade between them became vital. The League became dependent on Shire food, and the Shire soon received their metals solely from the League. Halflings traveled to League cities to build communities and businesses, and a few humans even began living within the Shires. Until eventually, in the year 3722, the Shires officially joined the League. And over time, with the League offering protection, the number of Shire soldiers began to dwindle. While there were still halflings that joined the League's armies, or guarded the Shires, nowhere near as many halflings volunteered for service, most believing that they could now do what they did best, farm on their land and enjoy a hearty meal or good smoke when the mood struck them. Sadly, this attitude proved a mistake, as the halflings faced a threat from what was once their greatest ally. After only a century, relations between the halflings and the League began to deteriorate as aggressive and harmful non-human policies began being implemented, and anti-halfling attitudes began to circulate. These sentiments eventually forcing the halflings to withdraw from the League and establish a trade embargo. Fearing a loss of their food supply, the League declared war against the Shires and aimed to make the halflings their serfs. As much as I would like to go in depth on the war, I know that I sadly can't do the topic justice. If you are interested in the details, might I suggest you purchase a historical document known as Broken Alliance by the historian Scott H. Washburn. I believe you would find it enlightening. What you do need to know is that peace was eventually established between the League and the Shires once again. Despite this peace though, I can guarantee the Shires will never again rejoin that nation. Although they will cooperate with the League when necessary, the halflings learned a brutal lesson during the war. To guarantee the survival of their people, the defenses of the Shire must always be in halfling hands. Well, class, I hope you enjoyed this lesson on the halflings, a people that, although small in stature, have the will of giants. For our next lesson, we will speak of a people who have recently become a major threat to the nations of Mantica. Next lesson, we will speak of the Rift-Forged Orcs.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on the Halflings in the Kings of War universe. And if you're interested in reading the book Broken Alliances, the link to it is in the show notes and probably up there linked somewhere. If you like it, please like, subscribe, comment, press the little bell so that you know the YouTube God know I exist and hopefully more people see my content. And if you really like it, and only if you have the cash, please consider sending a little money I made to my Patreon or my Coffee account, also linked down below. The extra money gives me time to work on these stories I love. Anyway, thanks for listening/watching, and see you next time.